July 1775. George Washington rides toward a dusty, chaotic Boston to face an impossible task. With no navy, no funding, and barely any gunpowder, a fragile rebellion must now become a real army. In Episode 4, the revolution stops being an idea and becomes a brutal test of survival. The man chosen to lead. When the Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army, they knew leadership would decide everything. They did not choose the most experienced general. They did not choose the most famous soldier. They chose Washington for something deeper: unity. Washington was from Virginia, not New England. By selecting him, Congress sent a message. This was not just a regional conflict. This was a continental cause. But Washington himself had doubts. He had commanded troops before during the French and Indian War, but never an army like this. Never against Britain. Never against the very system he had once served. He accepted the role without asking for a salary, only expenses, a symbolic gesture, but one that revealed his mindset. This was not about personal gain. This was about responsibility. And as he began his journey north to take command, he understood something clearly. If he failed, the revolution would collapse. Arrival at a broken army. When Washington arrived outside Boston in July 1775, what he saw shocked him. On paper, there were nearly 20,000 colonial troops. In reality, it was barely an army. There were no standard uniforms, no unified command structure, no consistent training. Different militias operated under different rules. Some soldiers obeyed orders, others didn't. Some stayed for weeks, others left whenever they pleased. Even basic supplies were missing. Gunpowder was dangerously low. Food was inconsistent. Medical care was almost non-existent. Weapons varied widely, from muskets to hunting rifles. Washington quickly realized this was not a professional force. It was a temporary resistance, and if Britain attacked with full strength, it would collapse. Discipline or defeat. Washington's first priority was clear: discipline. Without discipline, there could be no army. He began introducing strict rules, clear chains of command, structured training routines, standardized procedures. For many soldiers, this was a shock. They were not used to taking orders like regular troops. They saw themselves as free men, not professional soldiers. Some resisted, some complained, some even threatened to leave. But Washington did not back down. He understood something critical. Freedom without structure would lead to defeat. And defeat would destroy everything they were fighting for. Slowly, resistance began to fade. Not completely, but enough. Because Washington led not just with authority, but with example. He worked tirelessly. He inspected camps. He rode among his troops. He shared their hardships. And over time, the soldiers began to respect him. Not just as a commander, but as a leader. The greatest threat: supply. While Washington worked to build discipline, another problem loomed larger than anything else: supply. An army cannot fight without resources, and the Continental Army had almost none. Gunpowder shortages were severe. At one point, Washington feared they had enough ammunition for only a few days of battle. Food was inconsistent. Clothing was inadequate. Soldiers lacked proper shoes, blankets, and winter gear. Even basic items like tents and medical supplies were scarce. There was no established system to produce or transport supplies efficiently. The colonies were not unified enough to support a sustained war effort, and Congress lacked the power and the money to fix it quickly. Washington faced a terrifying reality. Even if his army survived battle, it might collapse from within. Holding Boston. Despite these challenges, Washington had one immediate objective: contain the British forces in Boston. After Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, British troops were effectively trapped inside the city. Washington's army surrounded them. But this was not a siege in the traditional sense. The Continental Army did not have the strength to launch a direct attack, and the British Navy controlled the harbor. So both sides waited. Tension filled the air. Months passed. Small skirmishes occurred, but no decisive action was taken. For Washington, this period was critical. It gave him time to train his army, to build structure, to prepare. But it also exposed his weakness, because if the British chose to break out with full force, the outcome was uncertain. A risky strategy. Washington knew he needed a breakthrough. He needed something to shift the balance, something bold. That opportunity came from an unexpected place. Far to the north, at Fort Ticonderoga, colonial forces had captured British artillery, cannons, heavy guns, the kind of weapons Washington desperately needed. But there was a problem. The fort was hundreds of miles away, and transporting heavy artillery across rough terrain in winter seemed impossible. Still, Washington approved the plan. A young officer named Henry Knox was given the mission. Move the cannons to Boston. However long it takes, however difficult it is, failure was not an option. The noble train of artillery. What followed became one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the Revolution. Knox and his team transported dozens of heavy cannons across snow-covered mountains, frozen rivers, and dense forests. Using sleds, oxen, manpower, it took weeks. But against all odds, they succeeded. By early 1776, the artillery arrived near Boston, and suddenly, Washington had something he had been missing: firepower. Now, he could act. The Heights of Dorchester. Washington made his move in March 1776. Under cover of darkness, his troops quietly fortified the Dorchester Heights. By morning, British commanders were stunned. Cannons now overlooked the city and the harbor. The British fleet was suddenly vulnerable. General Gage's successor, General Howe, knew the danger immediately. If the Americans held those positions, Boston could not be defended. The British prepared for an assault, but a storm disrupted their plans. And in that delay, a decision was made: evacuate. The first major victory. On March 17, 1776, British forces began withdrawing from Boston. Ships filled with soldiers and loyalists sailed away. For the first time since the war began, the British had been forced to retreat, and Washington had achieved it without a direct battle. It was a strategic victory, a psychological victory, and a turning point. The Continental Army had proven something critical. It could stand against Britain and win, a fragile success. But Washington knew the truth. Boston was only the beginning. The war was far from over. In fact, it was about to become much harder. Because Britain would not give up easily. They would regroup, reinforce, and strike again. With greater force, better planning, and overwhelming strength. Washington's army was still fragile, still underfunded, still untested in full-scale warfare. And soon, they would face the full power of the British Empire, in a place where the stakes would be even higher. Ending. George Washington had taken command of chaos and turned it into something stronger. Not yet a perfect army, not yet ready for everything ahead, but no longer a broken force. He had imposed discipline, held the line, and secured the first major victory of the Revolution. But leadership alone would not guarantee success, because the next phase of the war would test everything: strategy, courage, endurance, and belief. In our next episode, we follow the revolution into its darkest moment. when British forces launch a massive attack on New York and come dangerously close to crushing the rebellion before it can survive. Because sometimes, a revolution does not rise in victory. It survives in retreat. Subscribe to Hidden History Fact Vault.